Thanks so much for joining. I know here in New York City, I was going to say where I'm stationed. I don't know what's going on with me tonight, but where I'm located, it's a really nice night. And I'm sure it's a nice spring night where a lot of you are calling in from. So I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your evening to spend with us. And as I always do, I want to thank Vicki and PBS NewsHour Classroom for hosting these. This is our third season. We've been doing this for 3 years. We started in the heart of COVID, and we talked a lot about inequality as it related to that. And it's just so incredible to have Jeremy Ney here tonight. So Jeremy is the author of American Inequality. He's a former researcher at MIT, Harvard, and the Federal Reserve. So his day job's at Google, as Vicki mentioned before, where he works on privacy issues. But if you're maybe you're familiar with his work at Google, but I think you're probably most familiar with his data visualizations that we'll drop in the chat if you haven't looked at them yet. He's going to do an amazing slide presentation with that data tonight. And he uses data visualizations to highlight, you guessed it, regional inequalities and social divides in America. And he's going to be an adjunct professor this fall, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, exactly.
On a course on analytics for social impact. So I'm sure you'll definitely tell us about that. I have one question for you, and just the way these work, if you're new to it, but I recognize a lot of you, is these are, as Vicki was saying, we like to have conversations, and that's why we have everyone, if they're comfortable, put their videos on, no pressure, but we like to see your beautiful faces. But we like to have videos on, and we like to have it in this format because we see this as the best, the second best replacement for the best way to be doing this would be in a room together, but it's the second best with our screens on. And so we're going to start off with Jeremy. I'm going to ask him a question. He's going to go into an amazing slide presentation. And then he's really excited to talk to you all tonight about his work and field any questions that you have. And feel free to start writing questions in the chat. We'll start looking at those, and feel free to bump them up if you feel like it gets lost in the chat, because we really want to address your questions and maybe perhaps ways that you're already using these maps in your classrooms or with your students. So my first question for you, Jeremy, is, first of all, I want to say thank you for joining. I think we connected on Twitter.
Yes. Yeah.
I say it cringing now because
right, we're all great connections start.
Yeah, all great connections start, and hopefully there'll be a new Twitter one day for us all to go to. But I'm really happy we connected on there, and I'm a big fan of your work. I know that I'm going to be starting to use it. I'm even directing my students to use it this year. They're working on their final project, so I'll talk to you more about that later. But my first question for you, and then I want you to just jump into your slide presentation, is, I guess it's pretty simple. How did you realize that you wanted to use data visualization as the way to fight inequality? Like, did you have an aha moment, or I guess what made you, or was it kind of a gradual decision to go into this way of showing it to everyone?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying thanks for having me and for that great intro, and as well to Vicki and the PBS folks for bringing us all together. This is fantastic. And yeah, I think the reason that I really tried to focus on using data, to address a lot of these, social inequalities is, I think we are in this time where the way that we present facts and the way that we trust each other and the way that we're trying to better understand what's actually happening in the world is come into question in some circles, and is very much so, something that we're trying to dig to the heart of the truth of a lot of matters. And data is one of those ways where we can allow ourselves to understand really what's going on with many of these social issues. And I think particularly for inequality in America, that can be so interwoven with, so many challenges of income and healthcare and education and race and gender and tax and location. Using data as that force that can bring a lot of those threads together can be quite helpful. And in particular, I'm a huge fan of visualizing this work as well, because it can often, you might look at a spreadsheet or something and it can feel really difficult to understand what's actually happening with it, but those visualizations really bring that to life. So just to show you quickly about like, what a lot of our visualizations look like over at American Inequality. There are these, every article that we write has one of these, maps that you can see on the left here. And that's sort of that grounding force that allows us to understand, as we're looking across so many of these metrics, that map helps us basically, say, okay, this is what we know is happening in this county across all of those. And then we also make it interactive so you can zoom in and say, what's going on in that, southeast corner of Maine, or why are we seeing these, types of behaviors along the Mississippi Delta and things like that. One example that I thought would be interesting to start off with, in particular for this group, is on reading and inequality. And the reason I wanted to start off with this is because, so often we think about America as like this, highly developed nation with so many fantastic, resources and doing so well for ourselves. But I think when we look at reading and really start digging into specific communities and not just talking about like the average in America, and, Sarah, to your point about like how the data can help, show this, we see hugely different outcomes across regions, right? So, half of all US adults, can't read a book written at an 8th grade level. And if we look at that, this visualization on the right, we see that, 6th graders in the richest counties will perform 4 grade levels above 6th graders in the poorest counties. So you might be reading, at an 8th grade level in Loudoun County, Virginia, the wealthiest county in America, and versus a 6th grader in Jackson, Mississippi, one of the poorest counties in America, might be reading at a 4th grade level. And there's that strong relationship between income and reading levels here, and we see some of these stark divides across regions, which is quite challenging. What we also really like to focus on in this work is inequality can often feel really daunting, right? Like, particularly when you talk about this interconnected nature, you're like, how can I think about managing this full spectrum of challenges? So we always have this what we call like the path forward section, what we can actually do to make a dent in some of these inequalities. So on the solution side here, we think about, in different states, there are not required reading licenses for teachers. And I'd be curious, to hear from this group about, some of that. But, if you're in Alabama, you can just teach it the way that, you learn from your parents. That might not actually be the best way to actually help those students excel. But also at the same time, we know that teachers already have, so many requirements that they need to have. So trying to think about how best to strike that balance. And also the way that, gifted programs can also increase inequality in the classroom, particularly for literacy and reading. And here we largely see that white students end up getting put into gifted programs much more often than Black students do, and which ends up increasing this divide in outcomes and opportunity as well.
There's some, I wanted to amplify some thoughts in the chat. Jean said this data in most folks reading at a middle school level is astounding.
It's scary, astounding. It's not like phenomenal, astounding, because when I look at the books that are being pulled off of our shelves and those that are especially higher middle grade, lower high school, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you're banning this book. And I don't even know if you can really understand it to read it when you're saying that most people are reading at an 8th grade level. I'm like, holy cow. And then for those that are college educated, how did you get through college? Seriously, if that's where your natural reading ability is, it's scary. I'm like, I feel like I'm losing kids right now with that being the national level. So I'm going to pipe down, but it just, I'm floored right now with your data, and it's blowing my mind.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the, helping really shed light on a lot of these things and types of conversations and information that folks don't have is really a goal of our work, right? Like, there have been a tremendous amount of data visualizations on, COVID-19 over the last 3 years. That's like an area we don't really focus on. We're really trying to shed that light on these types of challenges that folks aren't really looking at. And also, Jean, exactly as you're saying, like understanding the ways that can like ripple through, communities and society as well.
before you keep going, one thing I just thought of too, something we talk a lot about in these Zooms, I'm curious and scared to see what your maps are going to look like in several years, maybe not too soon from now, when we start looking at the impact of book bans, right? Because if we have these reading levels now, what happens when young people have less access to books that might interest them? I'm concerned about where this will go. Has that crossed your mind, Jeremy?
Yeah, definitely. And some of these, we do look at those like, time series data to understand, how certain counties are progressing, and in particular, how state choices can, flip some of these things. And so, for example, I just wrote an op-ed in Time Magazine a few weeks ago talking about life expectancy and how certain, state choices that they'll make, around, drug overdose prevention, expanding the, earned income, tax credit and child tax credit, abortion access, things like that, that can very much so change. And I think, we see that whether it's, around things like life expectancy or, the books that you leave on shelves, it can very much so impact the way that states and cities progress. That's for sure.
Jeremy, do you want to keep going with it? Although Anne has a question related to this, and then maybe you can go to the next one. Just because I don't want to lose this.
Yeah.
Anne, a couple minutes ago wrote, and you can read it if you want to jump in, Anne, about your overlay question.
Sure. This is Annie from New American History. I can't figure out on my iPad how to fix my Zoom name because I'm not logged in on my normal device because I forgot to charge the other one. But I work at University of Richmond.
Oh, cool.
And New American History, part of that is the Bunk website and then the American Panorama maps. And a lot of people have seen Mapping Inequality, the redlining map. And, I kind of worry that redlining's become a buzzword catch-all phrase recently. And a lot of people just slap the name redlining on everything, but really it's not just that New Deal era. It's, you have to look at those other three maps about urban renewal, taking us from the New Deal into the 50s and 60s and on up into the 70s. And then there's two other maps that show the impact in the modern era, a sort of where they now map on public health data, and then comparing these neighborhoods on how they would be scored now versus then. And then the last one is showing the environmental impact. And I just feel like your map here on the reading, if we were to lay this layer on top of those maps, I think just from eyeballing it, because I look at those maps every day, right? I just feel like it would line up directly with the majority of red and yellow neighborhoods on those original maps. And I don't know if you've looked at that or if you make your data layers available the way we do so other people can import them into maps, or I was just curious if you saw a correlation there.
Yes, Annie, your feeling is observed in the data. It is that qualitative feeling is quantitatively accurate for you. So we do observe that in the data, and you'll see this as well as we go through several, of these examples too. A lot of these areas that you will see in red continue to stay red across many of these social issues. And I think that, goes to this point about how inequality is interconnected, right? Like literacy scores and housing, right? Students might not be able to, accomplish their homework and do well in school if they're coming back to homes where they don't, feel safe, where they have really long commute times and are falling asleep and things like that. And so, yes, it is true that a lot of this is connected, and a lot of it is also connected, based off of both income and race and demographics too. And so, some of those things that you alluded to about, historical choices that, the US has made about, how it'll treat, Black communities in particular, we do continue to see those communities struggling, over time as well. On your last point about, do we make this available? 100% we do. We're huge advocates of open source work and open source data. And so all of the data that we gather, comes from large US government agencies, the EPA, the FBI, HUD, places like that. And sometimes they make it really difficult to get. What we do is we clean the data and then we, basically put it on our website, americaninequality.io. So anyone can just download it clean and accessible to do their own, insights and understanding of this too. Because we also think that's really important part of the work. So with that, it might be interesting, for this group in particular that's made of many teachers to see, this article that we wrote on teacher pay. This was data that we got from the Department of Education. And, what we found from here and, was that teachers very unfortunately make 20% less than their peers across education and experience levels. So even, when you kind of hold those things constant, and that this is actually getting worse over time. So that in 1996, while teachers made 94 cents to the dollar, for their peers, they're now actually making 80 cents for the dollar. And very often 1 in 2 teachers are spending half of their income on rent. So, again, as we think about some of these, interconnections, right, like education and housing and location are deeply connected there. And what's also quite challenging is, for teachers in areas where students are getting, free and reduced price lunches, those teachers are actually ends up being some of the ones that are paid the least. So in those communities where students need the most help, kind of using that reduced lunch price as a proxy, teachers end up getting paid less there as well, which is, obviously can make it really difficult to create a strong, teaching environment. And we broke this out, you can see some of those states, particularly in the South. I think Arkansas has, 4 of the 5 worst counties for teacher pay. But as we think about, the path forward here, we want to try and pay teachers more from the start rather than this process where like it starts low and then gradually builds. It's like you can just help teachers earlier out in their careers rather than kind of dangling this out for them over time. The UK and Singapore as well have these really interesting programs that the US could learn quite a bit about on sliding scales for teachers that are working in high poverty areas and trying to give tax credits to those teachers. We're basically helping students in those communities in particular. And those programs in the UK and Singapore have proven to be really effective, not only for drawing in high quality teachers, but also improving retention and improving outcomes for students too.
And I love how you have solutions here. That's really helpful, right? And I think it's really powerful just right above the data and below it as well. Like just seeing the solutions, I think it's really powerful. And I see a lot of teachers in the chat wondering if Catherine wonders if she's in one of the worst places to play. I think you can probably see if you look closely, yes. Or maybe if you look at your paycheck. And I love your solution. And it's like, how do we get legislators to do this? Because at the same time that people are dealing with their college debt and grad school debt, they're getting paid the least. So of course you're going to see so many really talented teachers bounce because they're going to say, well, for me to really start making enough money to pay back my student debts, I got to do this for 10 years, a decade. And it's a decade of the debt accruing. So yeah, it seems like a really simple solution.
Yeah, and I think, going back to our joke about, Twitter earlier, I think Catherine had actually shared, a powerful story with, me and folks on Twitter about like, the county that she's in and some of the trade-offs that she's had to make as well. And, one thing that I didn't mention in this, American Inequality work is, we do so much of this data analysis and understanding, but in every single article, we also make sure to, include the story of a very real person who's struggling with this very real challenge, because often folks in this data science space can sometimes fail to realize that there are very real people behind these challenges. And so trying to make sure that, we're always humanizing and empathizing this work is really key. So Catherine, thank you for sharing that too.
Yeah, and I think you empathize it by just putting in the solutions. It's like the data says a lot, but reminding people that this data can change. It's not just a foregone, just the way things are. which I think is a lot of times how data is presented to people, like, oh, this is how it is. Anyway, moving forward, but you're here right in our face saying, here's how we fix this, which
Exactly.
let's fix it.
I can go on to a few more unless there were other questions that
Any other questions on this one, or do you all want to move forward? Oh, we got Nathan. Nathan, you can unmute. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Jeremy, for doing this in general. This is already mind-boggling. We're only at like 7:20. My question was kind of a twofold, not related at all. How do you clean data? And then kind of related, kind of not. How do you teach people how to read data? Specifically, I know for my kids, I'm like, here's a graph, and they're like, cool. What does this mean? And so like, what are the steps you can do to like break that down?
Yeah, so on the cleaning data side, it can sometimes be very difficult depending on like the government agency that we're working with, for example, like that actually has this, publicly available stuff. The EPA in particular is very difficult to clean their data, which is perhaps ironic because of how much the EPA needs to be cleaning up other stuff too. But other agencies make it, the census is fantastic. The CDC is fantastic for having a lot of that data. And I think what I often try and think about when I'm doing that work is like, what's the goal of the thing that I'm trying to show and communicate? And that then helps me clean it with that eye, right? So, I knew here that I wanted to, really show teacher pay by just, dollar income that you were getting. I thought about doing it like another visualization that we have in one of the articles is like teacher pay as a percent of, or how much you are spending on rent as a result of your teacher pay. So like other things that you could try and clean towards, though thinking about like, well, what's the narrative that you actually want to present is how I think about that too. On your second question about like, how do you get folks to understand the takeaways from, data and better understand it? One thing that I really love about like maps and this visualization work is the map is such a common icon of the work that, we all understand. We look at a map, we know where we were born, we know where we grew up. And so it helps us ground ourselves in a visualization that can sometimes, like bar charts or pie charts, you might not always know where to look, but here it sort of helps direct your eye towards an area. And I think on that point, it's also trying to help think about like, well, what is that one takeaway that you really want to draw your audience towards, right? Like, can you highlight, the highest bar or the lowest bar? Can you, highlight what's happening in, Philadelphia versus, Rockland County versus Nassau County? How do you want to show, divides between East, South, and West, things like that, and trying to make sure that the takeaway is clear, because humans are visual learners. Like we are ready to take in visualizations, but trying to say like, make sure you can direct someone's eye towards that outcome is quite helpful.
Thank you.
That was really, yeah. We have another question from Daniel. Well, maybe you can go to the next slide and then I won't forget your question, Daniel, because that's a really good one.
Yeah, so the one I just skipped over was on student aid and inequality, but like this is maybe a good example of that one. I'm gonna skip over this, but like, for like Asian students here, we colored that bar slightly differently to draw attention to the fact that, Asian students are, most likely to apply for financial aid, whereas, Black students, on the other end of the scale are not as likely to do, as an example there too. But I did want to talk about mental health and inequality because I think that this is a really important one for this group, and it's also very much so in the ethos of our work of trying to spotlight issues that really aren't getting enough attention. So 1 in 5 adults in America is struggling, with mental health, and overall 115 million people live in what's called like a mental health professional shortage area. So there aren't enough, basically staff to help these people who are struggling, think about like therapists or psychiatrists in those areas to help them deal, with their issues. And in particular, we see this, relationship between mental health and unemployment on the right side. And what I think is interesting here is possibly these like, cycles, these downward spirals that one can find, oneself in when you're struggling with mental health. It can both be harder to get a job as well as harder to maintain a job when you're struggling with this. And so we see these cycles of inequality that can perpetuate, as a result of not properly dealing with, some of these challenges. I think what's also interesting about this data in particular is that it is survey data from the CDC. So the CDC, asked millions of Americans, how do you think about your mental health? And, we in particular see regions in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, reporting almost 18 out of every 30 days, saying that they're struggling with their mental health. So the majority of the month, folks there are really having a very hard time. And so on the solution side, trying to reorient funding for mental health services. So right now we basically do it based off of population instead of on need. And so we could use data to better understand, like, these are the communities that need the most support, instead of just saying, like, these are the largest cities in the US. And so we're going to, send services there. And also trying to equip schools in particular with better mental health resources. So many mental health challenges, will start very early for the US population, and other countries as well. And so trying to make sure that we give support where students are, and young adults are most struggling. So that way later on in life, they don't find themselves, caught in these, inequality spirals.
And I just want to highlight right before the solutions, the 3 largest mental health providers in the nation today are jails.
Yeah, that was a mind blowing.
I've seen these maps before, but for some reason I missed that last time. Maybe just seeing it bigger on my screen right now, but
so like if you look in the kind of like middle central area of Florida is Union County, Florida, one of the lowest income counties in the US, but also has one of the most, and has one of the lowest life expectancies in the US. Folks there die at 67 on average. Is the state's largest prison is located there, and folks there, you see really high rates of mental health challenges there, in part because America hasn't really figured out how to deal with a lot of these challenges. And so we just end up throwing people in jail when we can't help them. And the prisons themselves aren't well equipped to navigate those challenges either.
Wow. Anyone have any questions about this one? And if you think of them later, we can go back to it. Oh, Sarah, Faye, that's a really good point, that the map for mental health also implies a strong overlap with reservations, which lines up with the solution not being population density based. Really good observation there.
Yeah, like in South
Good job, Sarah.
Dakota.
I'm being
Yeah,
such
like-
a teacher. I'm like A+ observation. I'm such a teacher. Yeah, but that's a really good point. Jeremy? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like area, you see that, counties in like South Dakota, in, Oglala, Lakota County there in particular, that has these, these like red spots in the middle of that, blue state. Those are areas, that are those reservations, where you see, several of these challenges persist. And across several of those maps, you'll tend to see those same, reservations as well continue to be areas that are struggling, which also goes back to the earlier point of like the history of America, and the choices that we continue to make in the communities that we continue to support or not support.
Karen has a question. So I guess Annie addressed Daniel's question about lesson plans and ways to guide teachers in their pedagogy and using these maps. Maybe you can jump in on that later, because I don't like to make a promise I'm not going to keep. So Daniel, if you want Jeremy to further respond, he will. But Karen brings up a good point before your next slide, and maybe one of your slides will address this. Dearth of info that government sources collect, gun violence, for instance. Do you want to speak to that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so while we largely get our data from, these large government agencies, we do, rely on other entities that collect this data. And in some cases, where there's an article where we really want to write something about, we've built like these fancy coding Python web scrapers to actually get the data ourselves to write pieces about that. yeah, it can be quite challenging. I think gun violence is like a fantastic example of that. Hate crimes in particular is another one where we wrote about, where, you know, the FBI does collect some data, but the way that they actually measure it, you know, drastically undercounts hate crimes. Homelessness is also one that's like very difficult to measure, right? The Department of Education says that there are 1.5 million homeless students, but HUD says that there's only 500,000 homeless Americans. And so it like can't be both, right? And so how do we navigate, you know, some of those challenges? I think on the gun violence one in particular, we've used publicly available data from the Washington Post several times. They make a lot of that available. In particular, they've got like a very powerful one on gun violence in schools. And, you know, they just published a piece on how there have been 380 school shootings since, you know, Columbine in, you know, 1999. And so trying to, you know, show where governments, you know, don't always maybe want to acknowledge, or they're not great at tracking some of these things, where we can rely on some of these other sources to help complement that information.
And I know we want to move forward, but Daniel has a question that I don't want to miss. Before you do the one on internet access, back to the reading level map, if you don't mind. He wants to, Daniel, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? I'll read it. Daniel asks, looking at the reading level map, it's difficult to draw any correlations to political leanings. You know, I'd have to ask this one. I see high reading levels in northern and Midwestern states with GOP control, along with low reading levels in other states controlled by the GOP. Do you want to speak to that, or can you speak to that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, some of this, right, is that there's that stronger connection between income than there is between politics for literacy. And while states, you know, do make certain choices about like how they'll train teachers, how much they'll fund, you know, certain things, how much support that they'll actually provide for students, and how we maybe sometimes think about that across, you know, Republican and Democrat lines, like, you know, wealthier counties will have higher literacy rates than poorer counties, and that can sometimes, yeah, show up in very different ways. Like you can have very, you know, wealthy Republican leaning counties, you know, particularly some of those ones that you'll see, you know, in California, you know, and you also see most of California actually has very, you know, low literacy scores, is quite red across a lot of this, except for, you know, kind of around the Bay Area in San Francisco. And so I think there are other factors that, you know, that matter more, but also, you know, as Sarah alluded to earlier, like there are choices that are being made now that we haven't actually yet seen mature in the data. And so these might evolve over time, and there are some inequalities that are much more connected to, you know, Republican and Democrat leanings. For example, again, we wrote this piece about life expectancy and inequality, and Paul Krugman about 4 weeks ago now, like cited our work in his New York Times op-ed, basically saying like, hey, we do see these regional divides, but we see these regional divides actually based off of political divides, and whether a state is Republican or Democratic leaning ends up influencing your life expectancy. And so depending where you live, that can matter quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what your maps will look like. Maybe, I don't know how long it will take to bake, but to see the impact of the curriculum bans and book bans.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not something I'm excited about happening.
Yes, no.
But it's from a
10 years off my life already.
From an academic nerdy perspective, interested, but from like a humanity level, I'm horrified to see the results, because I can already make some predictions, right, Jean? All right, so back to, you can move forward now. Sorry, Jeremy.
Someone had their hand up.
Oh yeah, that's right. I see two. Sorry, Vaughn, I'm muting you. I think it was Dr. Precious has.
Yes.
Hi, Dr.
Hi,
Precious.
how are you? I have a quick question for Mr. Jeremy. Looking at the map with the reading, like the literacy rates and mental health, I was wondering if you found any correlation as it relates to crime rates in those areas, because I specifically know, so like I am in Miami-Dade, and I started teaching in Liberty City. Now I teach in Miami Gardens. And I learned that when I went to Miami Gardens, they called it Murder Gardens, right? Unfortunately, because of the crime rates. And we won't get into like how that impacts, you know, the school, the community and all that. But I'm curious to know, have you found any correlation as it relates to literacy rates, mental health, and the crime rates?
We have not analyzed the relationship between literacy rates and crime rates, nor have we looked at the relationship between crime rates and mental health. It sounds like though there could be like larger things afoot in some of those counties too. And I think also like one of these things that we try to talk about, you know, with the data is, you know, sometimes like the relationship between things that might be causal and things that might actually just be, you know, correlated or even accidental. And they could also just like show larger representation of like how much that community is being invested in and how much, you know, support is kind of being given to like different social services across the state, you know, whether that's, you know, to, you know, police departments or fire departments or hospitals or schools or parks or roads or things like that. And so there are, you know, relationships between like how much an area is invested in and how well it, you know, performs across a lot of these social metrics. But crime in particular, we don't haven't observed a relationship with literacy rates now.
That's interesting. I'll let you move. We have some more questions we want to get through. There's so much great data here. So let's have you keep going through it a bit. And then we're flagging people. You can see how engaging this information is, this data is, because it's usually we're tired at the end of the year. And I can just, the energy in this room tonight is really palpable. And I think it's a testament to the work that you're doing, Jeremy. So thank you. You got our brains buzzing tonight.
Yeah. And I also want to give another, like a +1 to Karen's note on Kahneman's book on Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great book across many metrics and also for data work. Internet access and inequality is one that I, you know, similarly think as we think about America as, you know, being so developed. And this is one that I'm sure has, you know, resonated with like many, you know, teachers here as you've been trying to, you know, teach online and engage students as well, like how difficult that can be, particularly for students who don't have reliable internet. So, right, America, you know, has 21 million Americans and 10 million, you know, school-age children who do not have internet access. You know, to the earlier question about like how some of this data is measured, the way that the FCC measures it might actually drastically undercount that. And it's possible that it is twice as high, that 42 million Americans don't actually have internet access. And, you know, surprise, surprise, again, we see this strong relationship between income and internet access. So, you know, if you are born in a county where the median household income is $35,000, you know, born there from no fault of your own, you stand a coin flip chance of having, you know, any internet connection. And as that, you know, we've had to work online and attend school online, that can drastically impact, you know, opportunity for you, you know, later in life. On the solution side, you know, we like to think about this in terms of like public, private, and nonprofit solutions. On the public side, the Build Back Better bill has done, you know, an awesome job already, you know, helping provide internet access to communities in need and prioritizing those. But, you know, particularly for rural communities, that can be quite hard. So that leads us to some of the nonprofit solutions, you know, helping, you know, in the medium term, provide Wi-Fi hotspots to communities that are in need. It can take a really long time to lay cables and build broadband area out to some of those areas, so some of those stopgaps. And last is private sector solutions, right? Like, you know, I know that, you know, Starlink might have their hands busy with some other stuff going on right now, but, you know, trying to think about ways where we can help communities in need get support so that we don't find ourselves, you know, at risk of leaving a generation behind that wasn't able to get online.
Yeah. And I know we talked about this a lot during the pandemic when we were doing Zoom school. Some kids and even some teachers were having to conduct classes from parking lots to get Wi-Fi access, right? Because there are teachers who did not have a steady broadband connection. So it affects everyone. but definitely our students. Tamara says Department of Ed Tech has been collecting data on access recently. Not sure if they've released it yet. Do you know anything about that, Jeremy, if it's been released?
I do not know if it's been released, no, but we're like, yeah, continuing to monitor this a lot, because this is also one of these ones where we really want to like see some of this change over time and understanding how some of these, you know, investments have changed. Also on Sarah Faye's question, like there is, I forget what it is right now. It's something like 5 megabytes per second upload and 35 megabytes per second download. Like there is a metric for what broadband access stands for. And that's also something in the data where the FCC's measure really isn't sufficient. Like we wouldn't be able to have this Zoom call on those metrics. And so, you know, those types of ways that things are measured actually don't always reflect the reality of how the internet is now being used.
And Catherine mentioned that she's in rural Tennessee, and they never went virtual during the pandemic because no access, among other reasons, right?
Wow.
Yeah, like, but probably the main reason was the internet access, also just the overall acceptance of it being a pandemic.
Students didn't have devices either.
Oh, right.
Till the very end of 2021. We did put Wi-Fi on old school buses and sit it out in fields. We tried that. I had students that would come to the car wash where I was working and get access there and sit in the car wash parking lot, and I could check like my Google Classroom in the car wash. But yeah, it was really bad, and it started to get better, and then we had the tornado, and so now we're living through not just a pandemic but a natural disaster as well, where we had 2 schools flattened and a lot of kids displaced. So I'd really like seeing some information about how communities recover or what happens to scores after natural disasters. Like I talked to some people that lived through Katrina, but this is a whole thing.
That's a great question.
Yeah, we did a piece on natural disasters maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago now. We didn't look specifically at like how it impacted schools or education, but we did look at how it like impacted incomes over time. And as we know about this relationship between income and literacy, we can probably like reasonably make the jump that it does, you know, impact some of that as well. And then we also tend to see like the same communities that get hit by natural disasters continue to get hit by natural disasters, and you know it just gets worse and worse over time too. So wishing you all like continued the best of like, you know, working through that recovery. Where did folks go to the school buses when they were parked out there, or?
They did, some of them, but again, we live in a very high poverty area, so people were working jobs and trying to juggle children, and we live in a childcare desert, so it was incredibly difficult. I ended up just having to make packets of work and send them home, and parents would drive up to the school and pick them up, but it was bad. And then with the tornado, we lost 2 factories in the community, and millions and millions of dollars of damage, and factory jobs completely gone. We've lost a community store, and so now people that walk and don't have vehicles don't have access to food. So it's interesting. I didn't anticipate living through a natural disaster, but in the rural South especially. So I'm gonna have to find your
And as Sarah says, Sarah Faye mentioned, now add climate change and its impacts on frequency, intensity of extreme weather events, therefore on education. It all intersects, unfortunately, but we have the data now from Jeremy to show the actual impacts of it all. So that's helpful to getting to solutions, perhaps.
Yeah, so I can quickly talk about childcare, or I can talk about like, I don't know, maybe this case study here that kind of relates to Catherine's point about how we were able to help improve some internet access in Oregon, because it's like, we're doing all this data work, like, okay, is it actually making change in the world? And so, you know, there were 2 examples, you know, where we were able to kind of help communities out. You know, one was in Oregon where, you know, the policymakers basically reached out and they were like, hey, we know qualitatively we have this internet access issue, but we don't know quantitatively where to direct our resources. And so we help them basically partner with this nonprofit to distribute Wi-Fi hotspots to these communities, that were in red, these areas that basically, better needed some access, because previously, they had actually had a wildfire that had burnt down, kind of their main strip too. And so it was this particular community that was struggling across a range of metrics. And so we're able to end up distributing hundreds of Wi-Fi hotspots, and in particular to, homeless students as well, that, might be in a home one week that, has good internet access, and then the next week does not. And their, grades could be, suffering as a result, again, for no fault of their own. And then on the right-hand side, after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, a legal nonprofit reached out to us to better understand, where women would be most impacted by the Dobbs decision. And they basically saw from our data that along the southern border in Texas, women would now need to drive more than 400 miles to get an abortion. And so use the data to better direct legal resources to the southern part of the state to help out folks in need. So data can make change in the world, but I think it's also important to understand that it requires working with folks like you all and policymakers and change makers to actually implement the data and understand what communities most need.
Well, I think that's really helpful, because something I found with my students, especially this year, is I have a club called, it's an intersectional feminist club, and students have been bringing it up a lot lately, where we all kind of agree on the problems, right? We're all in the feminist club. They all consider themselves intersectional feminists, and they keep getting to this stage of saying, so what do we do? And I think I really appreciate that you're not just presenting the world and our country with this data, but you're partnering with people to actually enact change. And I mean, presenting the data can bring about change, obviously, because truth is, having this knowledge is power. But I like these examples that you're providing us with that we can then bring back to young people, and maybe even I'm not a math teacher, but show them how math and data and statistics isn't just something that you're doing in class that can't make a difference in the world beyond just your worksheets and stuff. I sound old. I don't think they do worksheets anymore, but you get my point. So I really appreciate these examples of how your data is making a difference.
Yeah, math is cool.
Yeah, math's cool. You've convinced me. After years of not, I think it's cool now. Really cool. Yeah, presenting the data and then doing the work is really helpful. Yeah, and voting, of course. We'll keep voting. We can do many things at once. So we have about 10 more minutes. Questions from people, maps you want to look at again, or something you saw that Jeremy flipped through that you want to look at?
See one hand up.
Oh yeah, Raya. Am I saying your name right?
Hi.
Ria. I'm sorry, Ria. Thanks, Jeremy. Ria.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you so much for sharing this data and the presentation. I had a curiosity to understand more about what you mentioned on the slide that had mental health.
Oh, can you say that again?
The slide that had data on mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
Maybe it was not this one. The one that mentioned about the solution being not to have gifted students tested.
Oh, yeah.
Might have got that slide incorrect.
Oh, that one? Oh,
yeah.
Oh,
On reading, on the literacy rates. Yeah.
Inequality, yes. I was very curious about this one, that how do you think the solution speaks to the reading and inequality part? I completely agree with the required reading licenses for teachers on training. I did not understand the second part of the solution.
Yeah, so on this one, and so there's not quite the visualization here, but we have it in the article about how gifted student programs, and in particular when parents are allowed to nominate students for gifted student programs, it creates inequalities between Black and white students much more often, because white parents are much more likely to nominate their students for gifted student programs than, Black parents of Black students. And so we end up seeing this widening gap between Black and white literacy levels as a result of this. So you can still have gifted student programs and trying to teach towards it, but it's when the parents are involved in the equation that you end up seeing some of these worse outcomes.
So essentially what we are talking about is don't allow parents nominated screening is what you, and parents nomination is what you would like to qualify the statement as.
Yeah.
The other thing is that just as a curiosity, if I may be allowed to extend it, that it is essentially not the gifted program per se in that case, because if a parent can nominate it, then a Black parent is also equally competent to nominate their child in that case.
Yes, they would be, but we don't observe that happening, right? So it could be the case, but it's often that white parents end up trying to advantage this system towards themselves much more often than Black parents do.
Oh, that's interesting. So and I think, okay, so I wanted to say one last thing. We want to have time for the raffle. So if anyone has any other questions or points they want to make, put them in the chat and we're going to direct them to Jeremy and he can answer them later. But we wanted to make sure we have time for the raffle because this resource is so incredible and PBS is being really generous to raffle off access to it. But I think the final thing I wanted to bring up and kind of connect it to what we've been talking about over the past year or so is a lot of teachers, especially even here tonight. I know Catherine in your state for sure, don't want to call you out, but in most states right now, because I think we're getting close to 40, and maybe you have some data on this. I think we're close to 40. I haven't looked at the data in the past week or two, but I think we're getting close to 40 states in America having maybe 38 having either bills or laws that are censoring what I'm saying censoring what teachers can teach or books that they can provide in their libraries. I think it's 38 states with either bills or laws. So not all 38 states have the laws passed. So that all being said, one thing that we've been struggling with just as a collective is brainstorming on how can teachers and school staff still provide students with the knowledge and critical thinking skills when certain content is going to put their jobs on the line if they share it with young people. And Jeremy and I spoke about this when we chatted offline, well, not on Zoom, but not on Twitter, about something that stood out to me is we talked a lot about with Dr. Uhura Williams. He calls it teaching by proxy, where you can cover topic content that's been censored by just showing something similar in history that's not the exact thing you can't teach, so the kids can get to that understanding. And one thing that stood out to me, and I know that maybe in some states this data would be banned as well, which is I can't believe I'm saying that out loud, but I think that it is a good way around giving kids critical thinking skills without being seen as indoctrinators, because how can you argue with this data? Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that? And what tips do you have for teachers in using this in places where perhaps the topic of racial inequality cannot be discussed directly, but perhaps with these maps, they can teach it nonetheless?
Yeah, I think what can be helpful with data, and I think in particular, the way that we present the data is it speaks for itself in many ways, right? And we don't do any fancy econometrics or, manipulating stuff. This is just as it comes from the Department of Labor, Department of Education, and just, shown, and it allows folks to draw conclusions from that too. And so, I think trying to lead with those, facts in that way can be helpful. Though the way that, some groups are thinking about facts can also, be put into question. But yeah, I would also be curious to hear from this group, what has worked well or not well for you in terms of trying to present data or facts or stories on what you have seen or trying to like push certain, narratives in different communities. Because, we do a lot of this like data work and publish it, but, many of you are on the front line of that too.
Yeah, I know we have to wrap, but I'm curious, maybe someone could throw in the chat if they've used this data. Maybe that's a to be continued question, but yeah, I am curious to hear as well, perhaps as folks start looking at your maps a little more and brainstorming ways to use them, perhaps we can come up with some lesson plans on the site, Vicki, that could, non-controversial use of data where you're not going to get fired or fined for teaching it. It's ridiculous. It's surreal. Jeremy, thank you so much. Any concluding remarks? And then I'm going to toss it to Vicki for the raffle.
Only concluding remarks is that, I'm grateful for the chance to chat with you all. And, I think one of the big takeaways for me in a lot of this inequality work is that, education can be the root for, so much opportunity in America, and that, without a good education and a supportive system, like from a very early age, that can really, set a child's life on very different trajectories. And so, having great teachers and supportive systems and schools and administrators and educators can make a really big difference in, whether a county or community, ends up being red or blue, in this analysis. And so, happy to continue to like help move this conversation forward because of how important education is for opportunity in America.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We really appreciate the time you spent with us tonight and the time you put into all this data and the solutions too. That's really stands out to me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll just throw up in the chat too, like where folks can find more of these articles, and then I'll also link to where you can download some of the data if it's interesting to you too.
Yes, and by the way, I was struggling with my mute button, but I wanted to say we would love to create lesson plans out of some of these maps, all of these maps, honestly. It's so empowering. I know that word is, I just don't know another word. It really helps to know the evidence, the data, the facts. And I know when students are, coming into their own and learning about the issues and feeling passionate about them, it helps them, make a stronger argument. These are the facts, it's the data. So thank you so much. So that'd be wonderful. We would love to do that. And I have a raffle winner. I gotta say, it's Tamara Parker. Is Tamara still here? I hope Tamara's still here.
And there she is with her camera on and everything.
Oh, it. Tamara, you get
Thank you so much.
We love it when folks come on. Oh, yay. Substack subscription for 1 year to Jeremy's Unequal America.
Fabulous.
I'm saying it right. Yes, and it's awesome. By the way,
I can't wait to read you regularly. Yay.
We're gonna send it, and there's a ton of stuff that is, I guess, free because he's that amazing that he puts on there. But this is like, we want to support our writers and our thinkers. So way to go. And
Thank you so much.
Does the Substack that has a subscription, Jeremy, does that have some other goodies on there?
Yeah, it's largely for like commenting on articles and things like that.
Oh, well, Tamara, she got the commenting down. She's gonna be good.
Amazing. Well, you have some work to do now. You have an extra another site to be commenting. And someone asked they want the links, and we'll provide those to people.
Yeah,
right?
Jeremy, how do you feel about sharing the slideshow? Is that something that you're okay with? A lot of these I know are online, but would it be all right to send these to folks?
Some of this we can share around for sure.
Okay, great. And then so we'll share the Zoom and have the highlight clips in the next week. So I'll send everyone a copy of that post when it comes out, so you can send it to folks who were not there. And I just want to say thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see your passion about this. And
I know.
Yeah. So, and Sarah, do you want to take last word?
Oh man, I don't know.
Jeremy, last word, both of you.
Jeremy put it best. I mean, I think, just to echo what Jeremy was saying, and then Catherine in the chat, that education can be a great equalizer, and then adding to that could be a great divider. So it's our jobs to keep, I mean, I'm just so inspired by all of you, because here you are in your extra hours, that your off hours, continuing to educate yourselves and figure out ways to bring this back to our students and continue making education be the great equalizer, even though there's lots of forces out there trying to not. So between Jeremy's work and all your work, I always feel really inspired, but I especially feel inspired tonight because knowledge is power. And then like the data plus the solutions, let's go take back America. I don't know. I'm just kidding. Now I sound like a politician, but like really, let's bring this, let's take or bring America to the promise and dream of America to everyone and fix this inequality issue. And these maps really help us get closer to that. Make America smart again. That's what I meant. Tamara, you have the last word. Make America
that trip to the White House really wore off on you. So,
yeah, I'm like, go America. Wait, what just happened? Anyway, thank you so much, everyone.